Good morning. Thank you all for coming. Thank you for supporting the best writers festival in America. I'm delighted to be back. It's really a thrill to see friends from the past, to meet new friends, and to get a chance to speak to people who are really interested in books, in history, in stories. I teach at the University of Texas at Austin, and I think, and the evaluations at the end suggest that I'm a reasonably interesting lecturer. But I know perfectly well that if the students weren't required to be in my class, some of them would have slept past this 8:30 starting time. I start at 10 o'clock in the morning, and they get in, but they have an enticement if I take attendance, essentially. I'm not taking attendance today. I give daily quizzes. You're not going to be quizzed. I'm going to tell you about a book that I wrote on the history of the American West. And it's called Dreams of El Dorado. I'll tell you why it has that title, but I'll tell you a little bit about the genesis of the book. And I'm going to tell you this in part because if you should be so good as to buy and read the book, actually, really buy the book, and then once you buy it, if you read it, that's fine. Pass it along. But the reason I'm telling you this is that I gave up writing prefaces a long time ago. So the preface is where the author tells you why he or she wrote the book and what the takeaways are and all this, what it all means. And I gave up on those because as a reader, I got really annoyed at having to read that throat-clearing stuff. I wanted to just get right to the story. So what I'm going to tell you is a little bit of what would be a preface if there were a preface in the book. I've been a writer for a while, and people ask me every now and then, often aspiring writers themselves, but sometimes just readers. They'll ask me, so how long were you working on this book? And I often have to fudge the answer a little bit because since I teach American history, I teach in general, at least, pretty much about every subject that I write a book about long before I start writing the book. So I wrote a biography of Ulysses Grant. And it was my principal project for maybe 2 years. But I had a whole lot of head start on it because I'd been teaching the Civil War and Reconstruction for 25 years. So I knew all the context. I have author friends who aren't teachers. And when they take up a new project, they have to educate themselves from the ground up. And it's a big task. And so I have an advantage there. But this is probably the only book that I can really pin down how long I was working on the book. And I can tell you that I was working on this book for 62 years. Do you not believe me? Listen, and I think I will convince you. How many of you have in your head your earliest memory? An image, perhaps, it's typically a visual image, and you know that is the earliest thing that you can remember. And you have that? Okay, my very earliest memory is a memory of, well, I'll tell you. So here's what I can still see in my mind's eye. I am in a cabin. It's a white painted cabin, but it's dark outside. It's not dark like the middle of the night. It's dark like this cabin is in a deep forest. And I can hear the rain on the roof, and the rain is dripping down the window panes. But the other thing that I can see in my mind's eye is the brilliantly colored scarf that my grandmother is wearing. My grandmother loved scarves, but especially the brighter, the better. Purple, red, you name the colors. And I can still see her, and I can still see this cabin. This is all I can see. And, of course, and I have been able to date when that was because I know when we were in that cabin. And that was in the spring or early summer of 1956. And I know this because I was told by my grandmother and my mother, this is my mother's mother, that the reason that I was in the cabin, the reason that my grandmother was in the cabin, was that she was house hunting for a summer home for her and her husband, my grandfather, that was going to be a place where their grandchildren could spend summers. And they bought the house in the summer of 1956. So I have a date for this particular memory. Now, so the cabin that they bought was not the one in the deep forest. My grandmother did not like cabins in deep forests. She wanted a place where the sun would shine in. And so this cabin, and in fact, I was able subsequently to go back and locate the cabin. And I don't know if the cabins are still there, but they were located literally a short stone's throw from the Oregon Trail. This was a cabin just inside the Mount Hood National Forest, near the village of Rhododendron. And US Highway 26 that goes through Rhododendron is the last part of the old Barlow Road. The Barlow Road was a stump off of the Oregon Trail, which had come all the way across the Great Plains, the Rockies, the Snake River Valley. And when the immigrants to Oregon got to the Columbia River, they faced the greatest challenge and the greatest danger that they'd had for the whole trail. And that was the danger of going down the Columbia River. The Columbia River in those days was not dammed, and it was a series, there's a stretch of about 40 miles that were waterfalls, rapids, cascades, cataracts, and so on. And it was often heartbreaking that the immigrants who have made it across the plains, across the mountains, would drown in the Columbia River. And so an enterprising immigrant named Sam Barlow decided that he would build a road that would allow the immigrants to avoid the Columbia River. And so he built this road around the south side of Mount Hood. And the road then subsequently became Oregon Highway 35, and then it hooked up with US Highway 26. And it was 26 when it came past where this cabin was. And just above the village of Rhododendron is a campground called the Tollgate Campground. Now, before Tollgate became a label for a brand of cookies, it was actually a gate where a toll was collected. And it was the toll gate on the Barlow Road. And it was located in this very strategic spot. The Barlow Road was probably 50 miles long. So where would you put the gate on it? And you had to put it in a way so that people couldn't get around the gate. And it'd be very tempting if the gate is here, well, you just sneak into the woods half a mile on one side and go around and get back on the road afterwards. So what Sam Barlow did was to locate the toll gate at this place where there was a steep mountain ridge, and this was Hunchback Mountain, that would come down right next to the Zigzag River. And there's only about 40 or 50 feet between the two. And this is the route of the trail. So you simply cannot get around. And so we used to have picnics at the Tollgate Campground. So anyway, I did indeed spend summers on the Oregon Trail. So the cabin, in fact, it was much more a chalet. In my mind's eye, of course, it was much larger than it subsequently proved to be, but it was this wonderful house that was actually much bigger, and it was in a sunny spot. Now, I didn't realize it when I was a child, but the reason that it could be in a sunny spot was that it was just outside the national forest. It was on private land, and the previous owners had cut down all the trees around the house so the sun would come in. This house was located directly across Highway 26 from a restaurant called the Barlow Trail Inn. And the Barlow Trail Inn was a structure of very large Douglas fir logs that looked like, and they probably did, date to the time of the great emigration to Oregon in the 1840s. And I and my brother and two sisters, we would hide in the woods, and we would watch the cars come along, and we would sneak across to Barlow Trail and would try to talk my grandmother into letting us buy hamburgers and bringing them back. And so This was the way I spent my summers. So by the time I was probably 6 or 7, part of spending time at the mountains, we called it the mountains, my grandmother, who named everything. And the more, I loved my grandmother dearly, but the more pretentious the name, the better. So this house was called Porta Coeli. For the few non-Latin scholars in the room, that means gates of heaven. And so, another name. When I was about 10, my family got a little dog, a Lhasa Apso. And my grandmother studied up on these and learned that these were the temple dogs in Nepal, in Tibet. And they would guard the temple. And they rarely went outside, but if anybody approached the doors, they would yap like crazy. And our dog did exactly that. But my grandmother decided that the name of the dog should be Tobias Darling. We called him Toby, but she always called him Tobias Darling. Anyway, so at Porta Coeli, I would spend summers. And in the evenings, we would gather around a very large fireplace. And when I was pretty young, we would be read stories. And so we read, or my grandmother read, or my mother read to us, Swiss Family Robinson. Perhaps you remember that. And so in fact, we built a tree house that was modeled on the Swiss Family Robinson. But my favorite stories were of the emigration to Oregon. And there was a book, a historical novel by an Oregon author. Mary Jane Carr was her name. And the title of the book was Children of the Covered Wagon. And it was a story, I don't remember the plot exactly, but it's pretty much like this. Actually, I know that it was modeled on an actual family that suffered a certain tragedy, as I will explain. And in fact, that story's in my book. So, it was a family of 7 children, and both parents died of disease en route to Oregon. And so the kids were taken in by other members of the Wagon train company, and they were dropped off at a mission that was operated in what's now eastern Washington by Marcus and Narcissa Whitman. And these children, the Sager children, they became sort of the model of the children of the covered wagon. And the reason I say this is because in all these kids' stories, it seems like in most cases, the kids are orphans, because that makes them, they get to act more like adults. And if it's aimed at children, well, children always dream of being independent and doing stuff on your own, which you can't do if their parents hanging around. But I and my siblings would play as the children of the covered wagon. And my grandparents were great sports, and they spoiled us, so they actually bought us a covered wagon. They had 2 or 3 acres that were on the grounds of this house. And we would play in the covered wagon. And we would imagine that we were these kids of the covered wagon. We used to hike during summers. And we'd hike all over the Mount Hood National Forest. There was one trail that was the favorite of my grandmother. And at first I thought it was because it was short. And she liked to get out, but she didn't really like to go on long hikes. And this trail was only about half a mile in length. And I remember the first time that we hiked on the trail, and I was probably 8, maybe 9. And doing what young boys do, I raced on ahead. And I ran down to the end of the trail. The trail was different than most of the hiking trails in the National Forest that clearly were carved out of the hillside with pick and axe. This looked like an old abandoned dirt road with the shrubbery growing up around the edges. And okay, but I wasn't thinking too much about it. And I got down to the end of the road, some distance ahead of my grandmother and mother. And there was a pile of rocks, sort of where the road seemed to more or less end. And the forest grew up behind it. And again, doing what kids do, boys do, I picked up the rocks and started throwing the rocks. And my grandmother, who rarely spoke sharply, reprimanded me, said, do not throw those rocks. Don't disturb that pile. And there were rock piles all over the mountainside. And I had no idea what was special about this, but she explained that this was not simply a pile of rocks. This was a cairn over a grave. And the grave, which had only recently been discovered, so this would have been about 1962 or 3. The grave had only recently been discovered because there was a realignment of the highway. And when the highway was realigned, the highway crews, maybe they parked some equipment along this road or something, and they discovered this. And it turned out, when the forensic historians and archaeologists came along, they discovered that this was, in the grave, in a very rough and rotted, really makeshift coffin, was a skeleton of a young woman. She seemed to be maybe 20 years old or thereabouts. And as best anyone could determine, she was someone who had died in the final stages of the emigration to Oregon. And when I say final stages, so this really was the last leg of the Oregon Trail. And all the difficulties of the Oregon Trail really had been surpassed. The first, and actually one of the most dangerous parts of the Oregon Trail, was simply getting across the Missouri River. The Oregon Trail basically started at the Missouri River. And getting across the river, it wasn't you're going to fall in the river exactly. The problem was that in the 1840s, when emigration to Oregon was popular, the river towns along the Missouri were overwhelmed by the number of people who would show up every spring. And the numbers overwhelmed, well, especially the sanitary facilities of the village. And this was shortly after cholera had appeared in the United States. And so the biggest single killer of immigrants to Oregon, would-be immigrants to Oregon, was cholera. And you would contract cholera from the tainted water around these villages. And if you could get across the river, you could get 100 miles or so out on the plains, then you're okay. So this woman had survived the crossing of the Missouri River. She had survived the crossing of the plains, which usually involved encounters with some of the Plains Indian tribes. They weren't particularly dangerous, in part because the various Indians, the Sioux, the Cheyenne, the Crow, they knew that the immigrants were just passing through. In fact, the immigrants were an opportunity rather than a danger, and fairly standard practice was for a representative of one of the tribes to ride up to the wagon train coming and ask for what amounted to a fee so that they would travel across the Indian lands. And the immigrants who were doing it for the first time, and most were doing it for the first time, but they were usually led by a scout or a guide who'd done it many times. The ones going the first time said, well, we're not going to pay them. This isn't, they don't own the land. Where's the title? And we're just going to go on through. And the captain, the guide, would usually say, no, it's actually smarter simply to pay them. But in those cases where they weren't paid, what would happen mysteriously is that in the middle of the night, the livestock, the horses, the oxen that were pulling the wagons, they would stampede, and they would be scattered. And then the next morning, the Indians would show up and say, would you like some help regathering your stock? And it turned out that they'd have to pay more to do it that way. And so there was this toll that was charged. The immigrants would cross the Rocky Mountains at South Pass. And this was something that was a great surprise to many of them, because the Rocky Mountains are the highest mountain range in the United States. It's the Continental Divide. But South Pass is the easiest pass around. In fact, people had to be told that they had just crossed the Continental Divide. Now, if you've been across the Rocky Mountains in Wyoming, where Interstate 84, I guess at that point it's 80 again. Okay, Interstate 80 crosses. you don't go exactly through South Pass. You go fairly near South Pass. But it's really just this open plain between a couple of mountain ranges that are fairly far apart. It's not like a pass across the Sierras. It's not like, passes most people think of. But they'd get across that, and they'd have to deal with thirst. Sometimes they'd run out of provisions. So this young woman, who, by the way, almost certainly was traveling with her family. It was almost unheard of for a young woman to travel unaccompanied to Oregon. And, it was a different time, and they were all going to claim farms, and to start a farm herself wasn't very likely. So she almost certainly had a husband. Conceivably, she was an almost adult, maybe adult daughter of somebody traveling there. It's also quite possible she had children, one or more children. By 20, she could have had one or two kids. So she had done all the hard stuff, and she had come around the south side of Mount Hood. So there were parts of the Oregon Trail, parts of the Barlow Road, that part of the Oregon Trail, that go around the south side of Mount Hood. And in the 1960s, when I was a kid, you could see certain parts of the trail that were particularly steep. So Laurel Hill was a notorious steep descent on the Barlow Road. And for the wagons to get down, they would tie ropes around the wagons. And so one end of the rope is around the wagon. The other end was looped around a very large tree, and loop it around a couple of times so one person could hold the end of the rope, and with the added friction with the tree, could lower the wagon down. And I do remember that in the 1960s, you could still see the grooves in the tree that the ropes had made. So I was told that I wasn't supposed to disturb the grave of this woman. And it didn't really sink in to me at the time. I'm 10 years old. What do you know at that age? But the more I got to thinking about it, the more I was intrigued by this woman's story. So who was she? And I could sort of piece together what must have happened. Almost certainly, she fell ill. Conceivably, she was injured. People broke legs and wagon wheels rolled over them, something. Perhaps she had a wound that got infected, and she died. Now, one of the intriguing parts of the story is that, I assume that she was a loved one of somebody, and if you lose, let's say, your wife, or it could have been a daughter or mother, you want to give them a proper burial. But the grave was very shallow, and the coffin was just slapped together, and the reason the rocks were there was to keep wolves and other animals out. But they felt they didn't have time to dig a deep grave. So this allowed me to eventually, as I was starting to piece this story together, to date it a little bit more accurately. How many of you are California residents? Okay, then you all know the story of the Donner Party. So the Donners met their very unfortunate fate in the late fall, in the migration season of 1846. And after that, everybody heading to Oregon, everybody heading to California, understood what the consequences were of getting caught out on the trail when winter hit. Now, in the case of the Pioneer Woman's Grave, which is how it's still labeled in the Mount Hood National Forest, nobody ever figured out exactly who she was, but she's a pioneer woman. They weren't going to get caught in snowdrifts. They weren't going to be eventually reduced to cannibalism, the way the Donner Party was. But they were a couple of days yet, maybe 4 days if it was raining, and it probably was raining. So this was probably late in the migration season. That was the reason for the hurry. They had to get to Oregon City, which is about 15 miles above Portland, because that's where they were all going. That was basically the gateway to the Willamette Valley. They had to stake their claim. They had to build their house before the winter rain set in. They were almost always really short of provisions by this time. So hunger was the biggest the biggest challenge. And so they were in a hurry, and it was clearly evidenced by this. So I grew up, sort of with this in the back of my head. Summers I spent mostly in the mountains. Winters, I lived in Portland. I grew up in Portland. And one of the places we used to go, my father would often take me and my siblings out on Sunday afternoons. And we would drive around the Portland area and go on tours around. My father was in the Army Corps of Engineers during World War II. And so he still had connections in the Corps of Engineers. So we could go into the bowels of Bonneville Dam. And we could see all the really cool electrical works and waterworks and everything. We thought that was great. But one of the places we liked to go was to Fort Vancouver. Vancouver, Washington, not to be confused with Vancouver, British Columbia. Vancouver, Washington is directly across the Columbia River from Portland. And it's so called because it was the original Fort Vancouver. And Fort Vancouver was eventually abandoned by the Hudson Bay Company, which operated Fort Vancouver. Hudson Bay Company, a large fur trading company, still in existence. And they had their headquarters, the Northwest headquarters was at Fort Vancouver. And they had a very active and thriving fort. The fort eventually burned down after it was abandoned, but it was reconstructed, I think, during the 1960s. And so we used to go over to Fort Vancouver. And I used to imagine that I was a fur trader or somebody coming into Fort Vancouver. And just about this time, I came across another book by Mary Jane Carr, who actually was a resident of Portland. And it was called Young Mac of Fort Vancouver. And young Mac is this kid who was, in the book, about the age I was at the time. And, of course, another orphan. And the deal is his parents die, and John McLaughlin, who was the chief factor, the director of the Hudson Bay Company, he was effectively the czar of the Pacific Northwest during the 1830s and 1840s. And he was a distant cousin or uncle or something, so Mac gets sent out, and he becomes the surrogate son of John McLaughlin, who was this very imposing figure. And I still can remember the cover of the book, because John McLaughlin, a real figure, and I've seen this, in fact, I've got a photograph of him in the book. He had this long, flowing white hair. In fact, he was called the white-haired eagle by the Native Americans of the region. So I could imagine that I was this kid. I was this apprentice fur trader. And the book described the annual trip of the annual resupply trip that originated in Hudson's Bay in Canada, and it would go overland across. In fact, they'd wait till the winter when the rivers were frozen and they're easy to travel, and they'd go overland until they got to the headwaters of the Columbia River. And then they'd get boats, they'd build boats, and they'd put them in the Columbia River, and they'd come down the river. And it'd be late winter, early spring by the time they arrived, and the people at Fort Vancouver awaited in great anticipation of the arrival of the flotilla. And the voyageurs, the French-Canadian canoeists, the people who ran the boats, they would put on their finest hats and brightly colored shirts and everything, and they would sing their boatman songs as they came down the river. And young Mac would be waiting for them. And in fact, so Fort Vancouver is still there, the reconstruction. And you can run down and look up the river, and are they coming? So anyway, so this is what I spent my childhood doing. I went to college. I grew up in Portland. I went to college at Stanford. And I arrived in the autumn of 1971. And a few of you look like you are old enough to remember that time. I want to take you back to that time in the history of California, in the history of the United States, in the history of modern technology. And in 1971, no one had ever heard the term Silicon Valley. So that part of the San Francisco Bay Area was called the South Bay, or the Santa Clara Valley. There was just a hint that something might be going on there. It was the beginning, so the transistor had been invented about 10 or 15 years before, and it was starting to be put into electronics. And there was an electronics firm that had been established some years before that was doing okay, Hewlett-Packard. And so something was coming along, but it hadn't yet happened. Now, I'm going to jump ahead a little bit and say that at that time, I didn't know, you didn't know, nobody knew that the epicenter of the modern tech revolution was going to be in California. It was going to be in what would become Silicon Valley. In fact, if you had been betting on the matter, if you had been trying to guess, if you were an investor and you wanted to place your investing bets as to where this high-tech revolution, if somehow you knew that this tech revolution was coming, you might very well have said, no, not here, it's going to be in Boston. Because what do you need for the tech revolution as it developed? Well, in the first place, you need some electronics companies that are already there, that are already doing some of this stuff. And there were more of them doing it in Boston than were doing it around Palo Alto or Mountain View or Santa Clara. You probably ought to have some top-rate research universities. So there's that school, what do they call it? It's the Stanford of the East, Harvard, and the Caltech of the East, MIT. And so if you were going to make a bet on which of these two, where was going to be the epicenter of the tech revolution, you might very well have said it's going to be Massachusetts, it's going to be Boston, Route 28 in Boston. That's not what happened. And one of the things that I was able to see just at the beginning of this, in 4 years, I was in Palo Alto, is watch this start to begin. But I didn't appreciate exactly what was happening. I didn't understand why it was happening there. And I did get an inkling, because when I was in college, in California, on several occasions, I'd go to Yosemite and go through the Sierras and go through the gold country. And it was really, and in fact, so at the Stanford Museum on the campus, there is the famous golden spike that united the two wings of the Transcontinental Railroad. And of course, it's made out of California gold. And so I was aware that there had been this thing that had happened. I mean, I knew it from school, but I became more aware, sort of feeling and watching where it took place, this gold rush to California in the late 1840s and the 1850s. And one of the striking things, and I didn't put all of this together until, you actually don't have to believe this. I'm going to propose a theory of why Silicon Valley and not Boston. Okay? And here's how it goes. And I sort of put this together in observing it, in kind of looking around me in California when I was there, and then just paying attention to this over the subsequent 40 years. So I told you, I've been working on this book for a long time. And it's this, so two of the ingredients that were necessary for the tech revolution, I've already identified. One is you have to have the startup companies. You have to have a few companies there that are already doing this, so other people want to go there to do more of the same thing. You also have to have the research base. You have to have the universities. And so, in California, it's Berkeley and Stanford primarily. But there's a third element that you can't quantify so easily. Eventually, you could quantify it, but before you could quantify it, before it even became an industry, it was a mindset. And the mindset that was required was a mindset that risk is the natural setting of success in business. You have to be willing to take risk. Furthermore, and accompanying this is, call it a normalization of failure. Now, you can decide whether you agree with me or not, but here's why California, not Massachusetts. In Massachusetts, there was still enough of the Puritan mindset, sometimes what I've called the first version of the American dream, associated with Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin was this poor kid who made it, I'm not going to say huge, but he was well enough off by his mid-1940s that he was able to retire from business and to devote his time to his hobbies, playing with electricity and overthrowing the British Empire. But his model was the one that was basically summarized by his alter ego, Poor Richard. Early to bed, early to rise, makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise. A penny saved is a penny earned, all of this stuff. So you need to have these good habits of character, of soul, in order to achieve success. There was enough of that Calvinist predestinarianism that was left over from the Puritan days. You know, the Puritans, the predestinarians, didn't really think that they could kind of peek behind God's poker hand to see if you were saved or not. But there were signs. And if you worked hard and you had good virtues and your business succeeded, your farm thrived, your business succeeded, that was a good indication you were going to be saved. But if your business failed, you're in trouble. So the response to failure in Boston, and I'm zeroing in on Boston, the response to failure in Boston was, you hang your head, you beat your breast, you examined your soul and said, what's wrong with me? Jump to California. Jump to California in the middle of the gold rush, in the early phases of the gold rush, where gold mining actually took place in rushing streams that are pouring off the foothills of the Sierra Nevada. And imagine that there are two miners who are standing there in water that's up to their thighs. The water's freezing cold. It's coming off the mountains. And the sun is beating down on their heads. And they've been working for weeks. And they've been moving tons of rocks and gravel and sand. And so one of the miners, and these miners are within spitting distance of each other because the claims are so small. And one miner reaches down into the water and he pulls up a hunk of gold. And he says, I'm rich. And the guy 20 feet away reaches down and pulls up a rock. Okay, so the guy who pulls up a rock, and he looks at his neighbor who pulled up the gold nugget. The guy who pulled up the rock does not say, oh, God, what's wrong with me? What's wrong with me? No, he says, oh, I didn't get lucky. And what is his response? He goes, finds a new claim, and he tries again. And in California, sort of the story of the California gold rush was, you fail, and you fail, and you fail, and you fail, and then finally you succeed. And you succeed grandly enough that you pay for all the previous failures and make a ton of money besides. Now, that wasn't the norm exactly, but that was certainly the dream. And it happened often enough that it was a very plausible dream. Okay, so which of those two is the mindset that is necessary for the cultivation of what's going to become Silicon Valley? And what industry is it that is based on that model? The venture capital industry, where you make 10 bets knowing that 9 of them are going to go bust. But the 10th one's going to make us all so much money that we're going to become rich. And that's why California, that's why Silicon Valley is where it is. And that's the lesson of my book. Actually, that's not the whole lesson of the book. There's lots more. If I had time, okay, so I am going to tell you a little bit more about my grandmother. After I got out of college, I went to work for a family business. And I went to work with family business not because I really thought it was going to be my career, but because I have the same name as my father, who had the same name as his father, who founded the business back in the 1910s. And I grew up working in the business. It was a cutlery business. We were importers and wholesalers of anything that cuts with an edge, knives, scissors, and the like. And so I felt a certain familial obligation to the business, to my father, to my grandfather, to give it a try. I didn't really think I was going to want to do it, but I gave it a try. And so my job was, I was a traveling salesman. And my territory spanned the American West from Portland all the way east to Denver. And the year was 1976. Now, for those of you who can wind it back, 1976 was the year of the American bicentennial. But are there any residents or former residents of Colorado in the room? Do you know what yes. So what is the nickname of Colorado? It's the Centennial State. Because 1976 was the centennial of the admission of Colorado to the Union. If you're from Colorado, and if you remember that time, you might very well have read James Michener's, the historical novelist, bestseller of the year. And it was called Centennial. And Centennial is the story of the emergence of Colorado. It's also the story of the fur trade. in Colorado. And one of the characters in Michener's book is based on a real-life individual who I write about in my book. His name is Joseph Meek, Joe Meek. And he was born in Virginia, and he died in Oregon. And in fact, he used to say, as he was about to die in Oregon, he said, I was born in Washington County, Virginia, and I'm going to die in Washington County, Oregon. But the story centers on his life. He has a fictional name, and part of the fur trade. So 1976, you perhaps will remember, was before the age of cable television. And my territory, as I say, was these wide open spaces between Portland and Denver. And so I spent many nights in places like Shoshone, Idaho, and Winnemucca, Nevada, and where when the hardware store closed at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, there was nothing going on until they opened at 7 o'clock the next morning. So before I would head out, I would put books in the trunk of the car along with my cutlery samples. And one of the books that I took along was James Michener's book Centennial. My grandmother, who is now living in an apartment in the Park Blocks in Portland, she loved to read books too. So we read the book simultaneously. And I was her scout on the ground. Because if you've read the book, if you've read anything by Michener, you'll know that he devotes a great deal of time to these specific descriptions of the place. And so he wrote about, well, there was this mountain in Colorado on the Front Range that where the snow in the springtime would form a cross. And the Spanish had called it, in Spanish, the Mountain of the Holy Cross. And my grandmother wanted to know if it actually existed. And so I was able to say, yeah, I saw it. There it is. And there was another instance where there was one of the ridge lines of one of the mountains, apparently, at least in the eyes of the characters in the book, looked like a beaver, which was the object of the hunting, crawling up the ridge line. So it was this stone beaver going up the mountain. And I spent more time trying to find that. And I said, Grammy, couldn't find it. Now, in fact, when I was in Colorado just last fall, I was talking to a group sort of like this. And a couple of people said, oh, yeah, you just weren't in the right place. It's over at Longs Peak, and if you look at it from Estes Park, you can see it. But one of the most intriguing parts of the book for my grandmother was a very fastidious woman. And she had her ways of doing things, and she loved to have tea. Tea in the afternoon. Tea in the morning, but tea in the afternoon especially. She had a very nice tea service. And so whenever I came over to visit, she would make tea. And we would sit and we would sip tea and we would talk about the book. And when I was on the road, I would call her each evening. I'd say, Grammy, this is what I saw. And I haven't been able to find that or so. But one of the intriguing parts of the book, very intriguing to my grandmother, was the fact that this character, based on Joe Meek, who spent 11 and a half months out of the year pretty much on his own, out in the wilds, in the mountains, dealing with grizzly bears and sometimes hostile Indians and the cold and the risk of drowning in a stream or breaking your leg or, all these dangers. And he was reduced to, if you remember that movie from a couple of years ago, The Revenant, where the Leo DiCaprio character basically gets mauled by the bear and then has to cover himself with the bear, really gets reduced to the most savage part of existence. So this is this guy, except for this one thing, this one ritual that kept him in touch with civilization. And that was at the end of the roughest day, the coldest day, when he nearly suffered frostbite. He would come back to his camp, and he would build a small fire, and he would make his tea. And the tea, the one that he liked, he would get it at the annual rendezvous. And so he'd get it, and the tea was Lapsang Souchong tea. So my grandmother said, Bill, we got to try it. We got to get some of this Lapsang Souchong tea. So these days you just buy it on the internet. In those days, before the internet, it's a little bit harder, but I found it for her. And so I said, okay, we're going to have the tea. And so I took the tea to her apartment. And it was a suitably cold, rainy, raw day, really cold. And so she brewed up the tea, and she poured it into the cups. And we were sitting there, and we were both going to take a sip together. So the teacup went to our lips. And my grandmother, as I said, was very fastidious. She never did anything like this. She took a sip of the tea. She went, oh my God, That is the worst thing I've ever tasted. She was absolutely right. Anyway, that's the reason I wrote the book. I've run out of time, so thank you very much.